The hospital was in shambles, cracked walls, dim lights flickering overhead, and the unmistakable smell of disinfectant mixed with something stale. Mrs. Helen Brown sat on a wooden bench, her hands trembling as she looked at the doctor in front of her. Dr. Kingsley, a tall man with tired eyes, held a single sheet of paper. His face was emotionless, as though he had delivered this kind of news countless times before. "I'm afraid the results are positive, Mrs. Brown," he said, not even looking up. "You have HIV. Helen felt her world collapse. The room seemed to spin, and she clutched her chest. No, that can't be true. It can't." Her voice broke, tears streaming down her face. Her body shook with the weight of the revelation, and for a moment she felt as though she couldn't breathe. Dr. Kingsley glanced at her, but offered no words of comfort, just a nod. "I suggest starting treatment immediately. It's manageable, but you must act quickly." Helen stood up, her knees weak. She muttered her thanks and stumbled out of the hospital, tears blurring her vision as she made her way to the bus stop. The journey home felt endless, her mind swirling with the diagnosis. When she finally reached her small house, she found her husband, David, sitting on the couch, casually flipping through channels on the TV. He looked up at her and noticed the tear stains on her face. "Helen, what's wrong?" His voice was full of concern, and for a moment she felt a glimmer of hope. She sank into the chair across from him, wiping her tears. "David, I went to the hospital today." Her voice trembled. "The test, it came back positive. I have HIV." For a moment, David froze, his eyes wide with shock. He got up and rushed to her side, wrapping his arms around her. "Oh, Helen, I'm so sorry. This must be so hard for you." Helen sobbed into his chest, feeling comfort in his arms. But it didn't last long. Over the next few days, David's warmth began to fade. He no longer asked how she was feeling, no longer offered comforting words. In fact, he started to withdraw, spending more time outside the house and avoiding her touch. The distance between Helen and David grew like an unbridgeable chasm. He stopped touching her, no longer sat near her during dinner, and often found excuses to stay out late with his friends. Helen tried to hold on to the image of the man she'd fallen in love with, the man who once looked at her with love in his eyes, who shared his dreams and fears with her. But that man was fading, replaced by someone cruel and distant. One afternoon, Helen was in the kitchen preparing dinner when David walked in, reeking of alcohol. He had been coming home drunk more frequently, and each time he did, the tension in the house grew unbearable. Helen tried to ignore it, hoping it was a phase, but tonight she couldn't hold back anymore. "David," she started gently, "we need to talk." He waved her off, reaching into the fridge for another beer. "Talk about what?" "I'm tired, Helen. I know this has been hard for you. It's been hard for me too, but we need to face this together. Please, can we?" He slammed the fridge shut, cutting her off. "Face what together? I'm not the one who's sick, Helen. You are." Helen flinched at his words. "I never asked for this. I've done nothing wrong, and you know that." David took a long swig of his beer, his eyes cold. "Well, if you didn't do anything wrong, how did you end up with HIV? I didn't give it to you. So what's the story, Helen? How do you explain it?" His words stung like a slap. "I've been nothing but faithful to you, David. You know that. How dare you accuse me?" David sneered, tossing the empty beer bottle into the sink. "It doesn't matter now, does it? You're sick, and I'm not going to be dragged down by your mess." From that moment on, David's disdain became more apparent. He stopped coming home early, and when he did, he wouldn't touch her. He moved his things into the guest room, leaving her to sleep alone. He refused to talk about the diagnosis, refused to show her any affection. Worse still, he began making cruel comments, dropping passive-aggressive remarks about how she was lucky he was still there at all. The final straw came one rainy afternoon. Helen had spent hours trying to make David's favorite meal, hoping that they could sit down and talk, try to rebuild what had been lost. She set the table and waited. Hours passed, and still no sign of David. When he finally staggered through the door, it was well past midnight. He smelled of perfume, and his shirt was rumpled, lipstick smeared on his collar. Helen stood in the living room, arms crossed. "Where were you?" she asked, her voice shaking with barely contained anger. David looked at her, his eyes glazed. "Out." "With who?" He smirked, walking past her toward the bedroom. "Does it matter? I'm not the one who's diseased, Helen." That was it. Helen's anger boiled over. How dare you? After everything we've been through, how could you say that? David turned to face her, his expression hard. Look, I don't owe you anything. You're the one who brought this into our home. I didn't sign up to live with someone who's tainted. If you want to keep living in denial, that's your problem. But as far as I'm concerned, you're no longer my responsibility. Tears welled in Helen's eyes. So what? You want me to leave? David shrugged, the coldness in his voice chilling her to the bone. Yeah, pack your things and go. I don't need this. With her heart broken, Helen packed her belongings, leaving the home she had once filled with love and laughter. She rented a small room in a rundown neighborhood and threw herself into her business selling secondhand clothes. It wasn't much, but it was hers, and she found a sense of independence she hadn't felt in years. Months passed, and despite her circumstances, Helen remained strong. She continued her treatment at the local clinic, but as her business grew, she knew she could afford better. She transferred to a new, reputable hospital with better facilities, eager to take control of her health. At her first appointment, the new doctor, Dr. Maxwell, suggested she undergo new tests to ensure her treatment was appropriate. A few days later, she returned for the results, expecting nothing out of the ordinary. Dr. Maxwell greeted her with a warm smile. Mrs. Brown, I have some surprising news. According to our tests, you don't have HIV. Helen blinked, her mind reeling. What? What do you mean? I've been positive for months. Dr. Maxwell frowned. I understand, but it appears there was a mistake in your initial diagnosis. You were never HIV positive. Helen's world stopped. Are you sure? He nodded. Yes, our tests are very accurate. I'm truly sorry for the error, but you are healthy. Tears streamed down her face as relief and disbelief washed over her. The nightmare she had lived for months had been nothing more than a horrible mistake. Not long after, Helen met Charles, a kind and gentle man who frequented the small market where she sold her clothes. He would often stop by to chat with her, buying little things and making her smile with his light-hearted jokes. At first, Helen kept her distance, still scarred from her past with David, but Charles' sincerity and warmth slowly broke through her walls. One evening, as they sat by her small shop, watching the sunset, Charles turned to her. Helen, I've grown quite fond of you. I admire your strength and your heart. I'd like to get to know you better, if you'd let me. Helen hesitated, memories of David's betrayal still fresh in her mind. But something about Charles felt different. He wasn't just kind, he was genuine, and for the first time in a long time, she felt safe. I'd like that, she whispered, smiling through her tears. Charles took her hand, and from that moment on, they grew closer. He never questioned her past, never made her feel less than whole. Instead, he built her up, offering her the love and support she had longed for. Meanwhile, David continued his reckless lifestyle, flitting from one woman to another without a care in the world. He had dismissed Helen from his life, but karma had a way of catching up. One evening, after months of partying and flings, David began feeling unwell. He chalked it up to a hangover at first, but as the days went by, the symptoms worsened. Finally, he went to the doctor and was told the devastating news. He had contracted HIV. David was stunned, his world crumbling as he realized the gravity of his situation. He had pushed Helen away, accused her of being diseased, only to find himself in the very position he had feared. Helen, however, had moved on. With Charles by her side, her business thriving, and her health intact, she had reclaimed her life.